Eugene Planning Commission meeting for April 12th, 2022. And I want to thank you for joining us. We're in this remote meeting format we're continuing to use while we work through the pandemic. The remote meetings allow us to complete our business while we're keeping our staff, commission, and public safe. And today, our meeting will start with public comment, and that'll be followed by a work session on the draft Envision Eugene Growth Monitoring Report. There are some housekeeping instructions related to the meeting format that I need to take care of first, and thank you for your patience while I work through them. Anybody who wants to access this meeting can do so by watching the live stream available on our website or the broadcast on Comcast Channel 21, or you can follow the access instructions that are listed on the agenda for the meeting. If you do join us via computer, device, or phone, I want to note that your microphone, your webcam, and your phone will be automatically muted when you enter the meeting as an attendee. If you wish to
recording in progress.
If you wish to participate during the public comment portion of the meeting, and if you haven't already done so, please raise your virtual hand now to join the speakers queue. You can do that in one of two ways. If you're viewing the meeting on a computer, a laptop, or another device, you can click once on the blue hand icon. If you're listening to the meeting on a phone, press *9. So let me check with staff. Do we have any hands raised? Or I was thinking we may have had someone who wanted to give some testimony.
You do have only have one of the speakers with their hands raised.
We do have one. Okay, good. So a couple more words about that. So when we're going to start, when we do the public comment, the moderator will announce you. I guess we have one attendee, and we'll unmute your microphone. I want to note that our public comment portion of the meeting we limit to 10 minutes. So your individual time will be based on how many people we have. And I think what we'd like to do is limit individual comment to, I'll say maybe three or 4 minutes. And then we can go on. So I'm guess we'll go ahead and hear the public comment.
Good evening, Commissioner Beeson and members of the commission. My name is Michael Havlick, Deputy Executive Director with Multifamily Northwest. Our organization represents 13,500 rental units in the city of Eugene and approximately 260,000 across the state of Oregon. I'm here because I'm concerned about housing supply and housing costs in Eugene. The rental housing market is incredibly tight, with vacancy tracking as low as 1.5%. I'm concerned that the city of Eugene is going to worsen matters by adopting a set of housing ordinances that will disincentivize independent rental owners, causing them to exit the market. The Envision Eugene Growth Monitoring Report is an impressive document, providing a thorough assessment and status of relevant economic indicators including housing. I read the whole thing. The document identifies efficiency measures that attract development and make projects more economically feasible. However, the document also asks, on page 97, are there any new policy or legislative changes not discussed here that may impact the housing market or economy that's not efficiency measures? As an example, new legislation or that affects renter eviction may be impacting the amount of rental housing stock. Additional rental housing data is needed to assess potential impacts.
I'm going to give him a second. I think he will pop back on here, maybe. We're still here.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. I'm not sure what happened there. I'm going to go ahead and join it. Well, I'll just leave it as it is. So the answer is yes, the proposed ordinances are not efficiency measures, and yes, additional data is needed. So we requested this data from the city's rental registry to track the staying power of small independent rental owners over time. And the city was not able to produce this data, and we've not been able to conduct the study. At their March 16th meeting, though, the city did publish a statistic that registrations have grown over the last 4 years by 10,894 units. That's an astonishing 32.4% growth in just 4 years, which doesn't seem to match with the reality on the ground. I have extensive experience with the ordinances adopted in Portland. We warned the city what would happen if the ordinances were adopted, and our concerns have been borne out. Also, the timing for the city to consider new housing ordinances is extraordinary. The housing industry is still sorting out everything that happened during COVID and still struggling with rental assistance. You're probably aware of all the bills that were passed in quick succession at the state level. House Bill 4401, House Bill 4213, Senate Bill 282, Senate Bill 278, Senate Bill 291, Senate Bill 891. These bills touched nearly every aspect of our operations, and the ink has still barely dried. We assert that landlord-tenant law does not belong at the city level. It belongs at the state level to maintain a consistent operating environment. When small owners are presented with additional complexity, additional expense, and additional risk, they will predictably begin heading for the exit door. This is not the time to place idealism ahead of economics. We cannot afford to lose these housing options. Thank you. And I would welcome any questions from you. I know you can't see me.
Thank you. Appreciate that. I think we're going to hold, we've got quite a agenda ahead of us in terms of the growth monitoring report and the time. So I think we're going to, we appreciate very much hearing from you. I think we're going to move on.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. So what I'd like to do now, I want to move on to agenda item B, the work session. Envision Eugene Growth Monitoring Comprehensive Report 2021. I'm going to turn it over to Heather. I want to note as we get started, right before I turn it over, we do have agenda item C, which you all know from looking at the agenda. And I just want to note, we want to be sure to allow 10 minutes or so, 7 to 10 minutes at the end of the meeting. So Alyssa's got a few announcements for us, and then we may also have some things from commissioners. So I want to just note that. So I think at this point, I'm going to go ahead and just turn it over to Heather, please.
And before Heather starts, I'm just going to jump in really quick. I know she's got a lot. She and Elena have a lot of information to provide you all, but I just wanted to mention how thrilled we are that we're able to provide you this growth monitoring report tonight. As you can tell by the, the depth, the width, the breadth of the information. I mean, this was no small feat to put this report together. The information is going to be vital to our growth management throughout the city, and it's going to be foundational for our future planning efforts. And so I really want to give kudos to everyone involved for the enormous amount of work that went into it, both from planning staff and staff from other divisions. You're going to hear about how collaborative it was. And of course, we couldn't do it without the ETAC and other volunteers as well. So I think we're just, I can't say it enough how thrilled we are to be at this point. It's taken a while to get here, but it's been slow and steady progress, and it's been really complex. And so it's just really exciting, and I hope you just gain as much from it as we have. So thank you.
Thank you, Alyssa. Share my screen here. Bear with me. Sorry about that. All right, can everyone see the presentation?
We cannot, Heather.
You cannot.
No, there's something that says slideshow and resume slideshow. We got like a corner of your screen. There you go.
Yep.
Okay, great. Thank you. Love this. All right. So good evening, commissioners and those watching online. We are, as Alyssa said, excited to bring you the first draft growth monitoring report. This is the result of a truly collaborative effort over several years between several city divisions. And while not everyone is here tonight that has contributed to get us to this point, we've got several people on hand tonight that will that we want to take a moment to go ahead and introduce ourselves. So I'm Heather O'Donnell, Senior Planner in the Planning Division, and I am the Growth Monitoring Program Manager.
And I am Elena Domingo, an Assistant Planner in the Planning Division. And Heather, you are not in presenter mode at the moment. We see the slides and then all the slides on the left.
Got it. Thank you.
I'm Thea Evans. I'm a GIS analyst with the Planning Division.
And I'm Mina Roth. I'm a PDD Portfolio Manager in the Information Services Division and the IT Project Manager for Growth Monitoring.
I'm Ann Fifield. I'm Economic Strategies Manager in the city's Community Development Division.
I'm Kevin Shanley, co-chair of the Envision Eugene Technical Advisory Committee.
Okay, great. Thanks, everyone. Sorry, I did actually practice this ahead of time, believe it or not.
That looks good.
Thank you, Elena. Appreciate it. So, rearrange things here. All right. So quick agenda review for the meeting tonight. We will talk about just briefly why growth monitoring is important. We definitely want to talk about the Envision Eugene Technical Advisory Committee, crucial to the process. We'll do a brief overview of the monitoring system. And then we'll get into the report, including overall lessons learned and takeaways. And the bulk of the meeting will, or the bulk of the first half of the meeting will be looking at topic area key takeaways. And then we want to get your input on the recommendations and the emerging issues, particularly if there's anything that we're missing. And then after that, we'll talk about if there's any highlights that you have for council, things that we should highlight for them when we go to them in June. We'll do a brief update on next steps, and then we'll pause for discussion. Oh, and I just want to say we'll pause for discussion after each topic area so that you can ask questions, and then we'll pause after each of the recommendations, emerging issues, and council highlights to get your input. So this is covered more thoroughly in the meeting materials, but as brief background, Eugene is required to have an urban growth boundary, or a UGB, that includes enough land to accommodate 20 years of projected population growth, including land for housing, jobs, parks, schools, and infrastructure. The last time Eugene's UGB was analyzed was in 2012, and it was adopted in 2017 with the understanding that there would be regular check-ins on actual development trends and then adjustments to growth management strategies along the way as needed if those trends are different than we expected. The monitoring concept is reflected in the 2012 Envision Eugene recommendation pillar regarding flexible implementation. In conjunction with adopting the UGB, monitoring policies were also adopted in the Envision Eugene Comprehensive Plan, including annual reporting and then periodically more comprehensive reporting like what is in front of you today. Monitoring data is specifically intended to inform the next UGB analysis, which the Planning Commission will eventually be reviewing. The housing component of the next UGB review is now required to be adopted by December of 2026. Monitoring data and UGB analysis impacts how quickly we might expand the UGB, such as into any adopted urban reserves areas, which is another project that will be before you sometime in the next year. So also, continuing on the theme of why it is important, here's a list of projects or programs that are related or could be supported by at least some portion of the monitoring program. Since we last discussed growth monitoring with you, the housing implementation pipeline has been added. What I just want to point out here is that you'll hear these projects mentioned in both the recommendations and in the emerging issues that we'll be discussing in the second half of the meeting. Turn it over to Kevin.
So good evening, Planning Commission members and others. On behalf of the Envision Eugene Technical Advisory Committee, which we call ETAC, I'm pleased to see this first growth monitoring report presented to you for review and comments before the report is passed on to our City Council. The ETAC, just for a bit of background, is made up of a diverse group of volunteers representing a wide range of interest in the community and brings together a really very deep level of expertise and experience for staff to draw on. Our makeup has been remarkably consistent since the inception of the committee in 2018, and kudos to those committee members who have been previously involved in the technical resource group, among other advisory committees, during the Envision Eugene planning process, and who have tirelessly continued to share their expertise. ETAC at first primarily focused on the urban growth reserves, which you have heard about and you'll certainly hear more about. But over the last 2 years, as Heather mentioned, we've been focusing on providing feedback, input, and being a sounding board for the challenging growth monitoring tasks taken on by staff. This project has assembled important but highly diverse pieces of information spread across multiple city departments and numerous outside sources, such as Portland State University's population forecasts and US Census Bureau demographics, economics, and population data, bringing them all together into one new relational database where they can be relatively easily and efficiently updated, and from which data can be pooled into periodic reports like the one you're reviewing tonight. This was no small task, especially in the midst of a pandemic, and we salute the staff for accomplishing this Herculean task. The ETAC members feel the information to come out of this database in the form of these reports is critical to provide policymaking bodies, which we are not, with foundational and up-to-date data which will shape and inform their policy decisions about the future of our community. As Heather mentioned, a number of these elements. After more than 24 meetings, ETAC members voted unanimously to move the first growth monitoring report forward, acknowledging that the annual summary reports and the 5-year detailed reports will and should evolve to represent the changing circumstances in our city and the changing informational needs of our policymaking bodies. We look forward to hearing comments and input from the Planning Commission tonight. So thank you.
So this is a graphic of the monitoring system. We reviewed these components with you all before the last time we met in October of 2020. But as a refresher, we have pulled together data from a variety of state, federal, and local data sources. You can see those, the small blue squares around the outside. Pulled those all together into a data warehouse shown in the large dark blue square. And then having that data warehouse allows us to combine data sets and create chart templates that can be automatically updated on an annual basis, depicted in the yellow square. And now we're at the We Are Here star. So we're pulling those charts into the first report for council.
So before we get into the report, there are a few overall takeaways or lessons learned from developing the report. At almost halfway through the monitoring period of our 20-year UGB, there are still limited conclusions in the report, partly because it's still not a lot of time. Partly there are just limitations on the data and additional things that we'll talk about during the meeting. But we have to have patience. We're setting a good foundation for the future that will help inform as we continue to collect more data. We also don't want the perfect to be the enemy of the good. Reasonable estimates are what this program is providing given the resources we have. We know they aren't perfect, but they'll get us a good ballpark estimate. We know there will be anomalies. These are just a few that we've seen during this monitoring period. And we need to caution that while the totals can tell one story, the details can tell another. You can't look at the data in isolation. And finally, one of our mantras is that monitoring, as Kevin mentioned, is not policy analysis. So monitoring compares one set of data to another, but there still will need to be additional research and policy discussion outside of the program. Monitoring is not going to give us all of the answers. So to start digging into the report itself, which you're seeing an image of on the slide, is organized at different levels of detail so that a reader can get the high points from the initial executive summary, dig a little bit deeper into the detail in the topic snapshots, or for a deeper data dive, go into the appendices document. The next several slides are key takeaways from each main topic area, and then we'll stop for questions after each section. So jumping right in, population. So as previously mentioned, we started with monitoring the metrics related to UGB planning. Some metrics provide community context, kind of general community context. Others are actually adopted assumptions that were adopted with the UGB analysis, and they're indicated on these slides with an A. So over the monitoring period, we saw about 17,000 new Eugenians from 2012 to 2021 over in comparison to the 20-year forecast for 34,000 new people. That results in a faster than projected growth rate for this point in the monitoring period. And you can see that in the middle graphic. So the forecast was for a 0.9% growth rate over 20 years, and we've seen a 1.2% growth rate for about 8.5 years. Growth is from births, but it's also from people moving here. And we often get the question of who is moving here. There's really not a lot of good data on that, but the IRS data shows that over the monitoring period, Lane County, so not specific to Eugene, but Lane County saw more in-migration from other states than from other parts of Oregon. And that was particularly from California. Over the monitoring period, new housing also grew faster than population. And so that is on the right-hand side of the middle graphic. For new housing, we forecast over the 20-year period that we would have a 1.1% growth rate, and we actually saw 1.4% growth rate, which was faster than the 20-year forecast and also faster than the population growth rate we've seen. During the monitoring period, we also got a new population forecast. And while it's not adopted, it just gives us insight into, if we started UGB planning now, what we would be looking at. That forecast projects Eugene to grow slower than we did over the monitoring period, but at the same rate for the next 20 years as our adopted rate for 2012 to 2032. And so that's, again, that 0.9% forecast rate. So slowing down, but still similar to what we're actually planning for right now. The forecast also is that after 2040, that we would grow even slower at a 0.5% growth rate. The new forecast for Lane County provides some more detail in comparison to Eugene's forecast. And since Eugene makes up about half of Lane County, we can use it for guidance on what to expect. So by 2027, Lane County's deaths are projected to outpace births. But net growth is still projected because of the amount of migration into the county. The forecast for Lane County is also that older populations will continue to increase, while people in their 20s will continue to be the largest share of the population. So I'm going to pause there and see if there's any questions.
Hang on. Yeah, Commissioner Fragola.
Thank you.
Hmm?
So you said that housing grew by 1.4%. Are you going to give us additional information on what kind of housing as we move into the report?
Yes.
Great, thank you.
Other questions?
Use your real hand, Chris.
Hang on, maybe I've got him here. Commissioner Ramey.
Hello, good evening. The correlation between Lane County data and City of Eugene data, I noticed that early in the report, and you just mentioned it yourself. At some point, will we be able to extrapolate that more directly to the city versus the county?
In the report, we do, so for instance, regarding age demographics, we do give that information for Eugene specifically from census data, but the forecasts from Portland State University for population going forward, the ones they provide us are, the age detail is for Lane County specifically. You don't get the Eugene specific. I think once you start to disaggregate it at the city level, it is not as precise as it is, as a prediction can be, at the county level. So they really just publish it at the county level.
Other questions? Okay, I think that's it.
So I will move us into households. So household data comes from the census, and they do the ACS, the American Community Survey, every year, which only includes a sample of households, but asks more specific questions versus the decennial census, which occurs every 10 years and includes all households, but doesn't ask all of the same questions. So here we're comparing ACS data to ACS data, looking at 2012 through 2019. And census data is the most comprehensive data that we have, but we also want to recognize that this data is missing people that don't feel comfortable responding or identifying with specific census categories. So there have been minimal changes to household size and composition. So compositions, whether households are comprised of non-families, families without children, or families with children. Eugene continues to have more non-family households than Lane County and Oregon, most likely due to the presence of the University of Oregon. We have seen the Hispanic or Latino population increase in Eugene 48% during the monitoring period. And as of 2019, that population now makes up 10% of our community. Owner and renter households remain at about a 50-50 split. And the pattern of multifamily dwellings having high renter households hasn't changed. The percentage of people living in group quarters is lower than at the beginning of the monitoring period and lower than we forecast. So examples of group quarters include jails and dorms and nursing homes. And this may continue to fluctuate over the coming years, particularly as the population ages. Eugene's vacancy rate is low at 3.6%. So dwellings can be vacant for several reasons. For example, it could be part of a recent sale where the owner hasn't moved in yet, or a renter is moving between units. And this ACS data is consistent with what we've heard from local appraisers and realtors who've reported that vacancy rates are low, resulting in a tight rental and home buying market. And so to put that a little bit more perspective, so that 3.6, comparing that to a healthy vacancy rate for a rental market is about 7 to 8%. And then moving into affordability, we're combining households and affordability, and then I'll pause. So the poverty level has decreased over the monitoring period as we've seen the national and local economy improve, down to 17% in 2019. But there are many more households above the poverty level who still struggle to afford a bare bones household budget. There was a 31% increase in median household income and a 32% increase in median gross rent. The median sales prices for single-family homes, which includes detached and attached dwellings, has increased 119% since 2012. And that number is pretty high, but when we compare it to nearby cities, Eugene actually had the lowest percent increase in single-family median sales. So a couple other examples, Springfield had 176% increase and Cottage Grove had 186% increase. There was a 96% increase in 2 to 4 dwelling sales and a 286% increase in 5+ dwelling sales. The cost burden households have slightly decreased, but they still make up 41% of Eugene households. So households are considered cost burden if they pay more than 30% of their income on housing. So as of 2019, 56% of renter households and 25% of owner households are cost burden. There's a significant shortage of housing for households making less than $25,000 a year. And there's also unavailability for households making more than $100,000 a year. So this means that the households making less than $25,000 are remaining in housing that costs more than they can afford to pay. And those households making more than $100,000 are in housing probably that costs less than they can afford, which results in impacts to available housing for those households in those more middle income ranges. And I'll pause there for questions on households and affordability.
Questions? Commissioner Fragola.
So did I hear you say that our vacancy rate is 3.6% and a healthy vacancy rate is 70%?
7 to 8, sorry.
7 to 8, okay. I was like, whoa, that's a really big difference. And so can you give me some perspective about, what was the vacancy rates, let's say 5 years ago, 10 years ago, like how has this changed over time for our community?
Yeah, give me one moment. Pull up some numbers. So in 2012, it was 5.1% when we started monitoring. And so it's fluctuated a bit over the past 8 years. So the highest between 2012 and 2019, it was at 7% in 2016. And so we've seen it pretty much sharply decline since 2016. And 3.6 is the lowest, at least since 2012. I don't have, at least in front of me, numbers farther back than that. But we can get that if you'd like.
Okay, and I am just curious, that is for Lane County, and so that's for
That
Eugene.
is for Eugene.
So how does that compare to the rest of the state?
That is also a good question. Let's see if I have that.
Which I know is, it's a that may not be apples and oranges, but
Right.
we talk about metro areas and rural areas, but I would just be curious to know what it is for the state.
Let me work on getting that number because I think I can, but I don't have it available at the second.
Okay, great, thank you.
Commissioner Edwards.
Thanks, Chair Beeson. I have a comment and a question. The comment is, Elena, it's really helpful to have a comparison. So I think that was something that I think was missing from our conversations. When you can compare Eugene and I've got the presentation open here, but I don't see the stat that you had just mentioned. Oh yeah, right here. The 119% increase in single family dwellings.
Mm-hmm.
It can sound like that doesn't really, it doesn't really mean a whole lot, but then when you can compare it to 176,000 increase in Springfield and Veneta and places like that, I think that actually kind of puts it in context. The other thing I wanted to bring up was that I'm curious about the vacancy rate you mentioned, because I do know, we captured a snapshot and I know that has gone way down. I had a meeting with realtors today and they said 1.4 is where Eugene is at right now. So yeah. I'm just curious if this is something that will reflect in.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've heard some lower vacancy rate numbers as well. And so important reminder that this was from the census data and the most recent we have is 2019. So it is lagging a bit, but even so, we can see short of that sharp decline from 2016 that it's kind of going pretty sharply down. So that's not surprising to hear that it has continued to go down since 2019.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, I think we can move on.
Okay. Moving on to jobs. So similar to population, UGB planning depends on a forecast for new jobs for 20 years. The data that we have in the monitoring period for Eugene is through 2018. And we added almost 20,000 new covered jobs. Covered jobs are those covered by unemployment insurance, and that's what's reported to the state is covered jobs data. This is faster than expected for this point in the monitoring period. So the forecast was for 1.4% through 2032, and we've seen an annual job growth rate for Eugene through 2018 at 3.1%. The UGB planning also includes assumptions for how many of Eugene's new jobs would be in broad employment categories. So according to the 2018 data, the mix of Eugene's job types in 2018 actually was pretty close to the mix of the that was forecast for new jobs. And so what that equates to is that about half of Eugene's jobs are what we call or categorized as commercial non-retail, which is essentially mostly dominated by office related uses, and then split almost evenly between retail jobs, government or public jobs, and industrial manufacturing jobs. So as I mentioned, the Eugene data, the Eugene specific data is up to 2018. That's because we get jobs data from the state, and it starts out at the county level. There's a confidential disaggregation process that we have to follow to get it to the Eugene level. And so we don't do that every year. So we're always going to be lagging a little bit in our jobs data. In this case, it actually kind of worked out because it was before the COVID-19 impacts. The next time we do monitoring, we'll be able to see that more. During the monitoring period, similar to population forecasting, the county also received a new employment forecast for the next 10 years. So population forecasting is done at 20 years. Jobs forecasting that we get from the state is for 10 years. And that is actually for a growth rate of 1.4%. So slowing down to actually match what we are currently planning for in the 20-year UGB, which is kind of interesting because that's what happened with population as well. And I guess the other thing I wanted to mention here, which we mentioned in the report, is that as of, I think it was November, or it might have been this summer, the state indicated that Lane County had actually added almost 50% of the jobs that they had lost during April and March of 2020 had already added those back. And so that's a really good sign. That's a much quicker recovery than we've seen before. So pause here for specific questions.
Well, I'd like to ask a question. Can you go back to the slide you were just on? The jobs, if you can't, that's fine. Yeah. And I don't need to go into a lot of detail. Some of my questions I found as I was reviewing the information, and it was very interesting, thought-provoking. Found myself kind of looking at numbers and trying to figure out sort of how they work together. So when I look at this, the original forecast for the total 20-year period is 1.4%, and the actual in the first 6 years is 3.1. And then for the remainder, you're going at 1.4 from some information I think I was hearing that you got from the county. I'm just kind of wondering in general, it seems like the 3.1 for the first 6 years is some kind of a signal that it might be more. I'm just wondering, is the 1.4, where does that 1.4 come from? And it seems like it might be low.
Yeah, so just to clarify, we're not readopting the 1.4% that came from the state for this 2020 to 2030. It's just, we want to, we adopted this 1.4% for 2012 to 2032, which actually was derived from the same source, the state forecast for Lane County. So back in 2012, we got a forecast from the state for Lane County that was 1.4%, and we adopted that same percentage of growth rate. My understanding, and I'll just throw a nod out to Anne if she has anything more she wants to say, but my understanding is that it's actually not very surprising that we were growing faster from 2012 to 2018 for jobs, because we were actually just coming off a recession, which ended around 2010. And so it kind of makes sense that we were adding jobs back quicker. The state is planning on giving counties a job forecast every year going forward. They were not doing that before, but they are planning to do that now. And so by the time we actually get to UGB planning, we will have another forecast from the state for the county, and we'll be able to have that discussion about you know, this is a 10-year forecast. We need a 20-year forecast for Eugene. And so is it right to use that same forecast? Is there some other considerations that we need to make, given that we need to project it out 20 years and that it is just for Eugene? That said, Eugene is the job center for Lane County. And so a lot of that growth rate is going to be for Eugene. And did you have anything you wanted to add?
I think you got it. You hit it on the head, Heather. I think that's about right. And just remember that the first forecast, the 1.4 for Eugene, was a 20-year one, and then we saw faster in that first 6-year period. It was faster on an annual basis than what the 20-year annual basis projection was. And so, you know, it could, in 2032, you know, who knows what'll happen. Maybe the average annual will be 1.4. We're not there yet. And there's been a number of extremely unexpected events in the last few years. The global pandemic has definitely affected things. Although, as Heather pointed out, we've recovered the jobs that we lost in that. But this, it's sort of different. It's not quite apples to oranges. It's apple varieties to apple varieties. With 20-year forecasts are so difficult. It's on an average annual basis. And then the state continues to project that we think we'll have about 1.4. Maybe we're growing faster than they quite realize.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. That helps me. So do we have other questions? I'm not seeing any. Okay, I think we can move on.
All right, let's move into building permits. And I just want to say, Anne, thanks for bringing that up. I probably should have said this in the beginning. When I was mentioning that it is difficult, even though we're almost halfway through the monitoring period, sometimes that's not long enough to make conclusions about the data that you're seeing. That's one of the reasons, is because we're tracking market data, we're tracking employment data and things that go in cycles and up and down. And so sometimes if you're really just looking at this period, but your projections for for double that, you might be looking at a really fast period that once it slows down, you actually might be pretty close to what you forecasted for the 20-year period. And that's what makes some of this so challenging. Okay, so moving into building permit data, the map you're seeing shows that this is basically the new dwellings that we've seen across the city through the monitoring period 2012 through issued permits through July of 2021. You see that new dwellings happened all over the city. The larger red dots are concentrations of multifamily dwellings. You can see that there's more of them around downtown and Franklin Boulevard. I think we all have seen that happening, but I think it's also good to see that there is a larger development occurring in other parts of the city. There are also some yellowish dots, which again are kind of hard to see at this scale. Those represent single family dwellings because they're just representing one unit. That's why they're smaller. But again, you can see that those are really happening all over the city. All right, so now we will get into the earlier question about what type of housing that we're seeing. So some takeaways regarding the new dwellings and the buildings that they are in. Over the monitoring period, 53% of the forecast, of the 20-year forecast, so when we're talking about a forecast that was adopted, it's for that 20-year period. So 53% of the forecast for new dwellings have been permitted, which is about 8,000 of the 15,000 needed. So we're on track from a total standpoint. But I have to put a note of caution here. The UGB forecast and UGB planning is for new housing to address specifically your population growth. Existing underproduction or deficit of housing and housing affordability are still issues in Eugene, and so those are specifically called out in the report recommendation. Because when we do UGB planning, there's a little bit of a box that that we're put in where we're addressing population growth. And that's where the housing implementation plan comes in, because it can look broader than just new housing for population growth. So now when we dig into the details, we see that the housing mix, the mix of the types of dwellings that we've seen are different than what was forecast. So for new dwellings in the monitoring period, 27% of them were single family detached, and 55% of them were, the forecast predicted 55% of them to be single family detached. And then comparatively, 72% of our new dwellings have been multifamily dwellings compared to the forecast for 37%. And I want to note here that I am using the terminology that was used in the UGB analysis of single family and multifamily rather than single unit and multi-unit, which is what has been discussed in the Middle Housing Project. We recognize that. We will be updating our language once Middle Housing has completed that project and in the next round of monitoring. So does that mean the housing forecast is wrong? Not necessarily. Well, we know all of our forecasts are going to be wrong to some degree, but is it that wrong? Not necessarily. Economic cycles often are more favorable for one housing type at one point in time than another another housing type, and then sometimes they flip. And so clearly we're in a period right now that is favorable for larger multifamily construction. And in addition, 35% of that new multifamily that we've seen has been identified as potentially student housing oriented. So clearly there is still a market for that, even though I think we've been hearing for a long time that people think that that is going to slow down. Regarding density, new housing has generally been denser than what the forecast predicted, but it's not exactly, it's not exactly an apples to apples comparison, because we are collecting density data differently now than we did during the UGB analysis. So we feel comfortable saying that things have been happening differently or more dense, but not exactly how much more dense. In the way that we're collecting the data now, it's real time with the building permits. And so what we've seen is that the highest density has been coming in on commercial land at 78 dwellings per acre. And I'm sorry, I'm getting a notification that we may have something wrong with the meeting. guess we are fine. Okay. It looks like I can see everybody's camera. I was getting a notification that we couldn't see people's cameras, but it looks like, just doing a quick check here, it looks like I can see everyone. Okay, so I'm just gonna keep going. So 78 units per acre, dwellings per acre on commercial land, which is pretty high. And then the highest density, the building type with the highest density is buildings with 5 or more dwellings. And those were 83 dwellings per acre. On the flip side, there are some types of land where we're actually lacking new monitoring data. That was mostly dwellings on sloped land. And that's because 92% of our new dwellings have been on flat land, which is a lot. So moving into efficiency measures. Efficiency measures, or sometimes called development incentives, are actions the city takes to facilitate more compact development than would otherwise occur if we didn't take those actions, thereby minimizing expansion of the UGB as required by state law. Examples of dwellings from efficiency measures are those that benefited from the city changing the land use code to make it easier for housing, or that received a financial incentive like reduced permit fees or tax relief. So again, looking at totals, dwellings from efficiency measures on total are on pace. 68% of the almost 3,300 dwellings from efficiency measures have been met, the 2248 that you see on the graphic there. But when breaking it down by individual efficiency measure tool or by comprehensive plan designation, we get a different story. On pace, multifamily development downtown, and actually accessory dwellings since the code was amended and permitting fees were reduced. Those are on pace. Where efficiency measures are off pace or are close to on pace, but we need to keep an eye on it, are low density residential. That is partially because one of our biggest efficiency measure areas for low density housing is the Crow Road area, and there currently aren't main utilities there to allow annexation and subsequent development. MUPD, the multiple unit property tax exemption program, since it was revamped in 2013, it hasn't been used as much as anticipated. That is excluding, I need to make a really important point here, that is excluding the recent MUPD approval for the riverfront redevelopment. That's not included in this report because it just happened. We'll catch that in the next report. And then medium density residential, we're seeing higher densities than in the past. So that's good, but not quite at the level that we projected. Part of that is because the efficiency measure for medium density only went into effect in 2017. Okay, and so now takeaways regarding how land has developed with housing. We have seen more housing develop on land that was considered fully developed in our adopted buildable lands inventory than we expected to see at this point. Almost half of new dwellings on developed land have been on commercial. And I think the other point here about redevelopment is that it's pretty difficult, or it was pretty difficult to predict during the UGB analysis. And we're now getting that data at the time of building permit. So it's not surprising that we're not exactly matching up with what we projected, but this will really help us the next time we do the UGB analysis. So we've seen development happen faster on commercial and high density residential land and slower on low and medium density residential land. Overall, 47% of all the new dwellings that we've seen over the monitoring period have been on commercial and high density land. And, you know, I think that part of the reason that we've seen slower development of low and medium density residential land is because utilities are needed for annexation for more of Eugene's low density and medium density residential land than commercial and high density, which is mostly already served and annexed. The result was that over the monitoring period, 510 residential acres were developed with 5,400 dwellings compared to 33 acres of commercial that was developed with 2,300 dwellings. So I thought that was just an interesting statistic to pull out. All right, pause for questions.
Commissioner Edwards.
Thank you. A couple of thoughts just kind of popped into my head as I was listening. And Heather, one of the things, obviously we've all seen the student housing happening around Franklin. We know that I'm assuming at least several of those developments were able to take advantage of the MUPTI before it was eliminated for that specific type of housing. I'm wondering if there was any correlation that we made or data that we might consider that might tie enrollment, because it you know, while we talked about this big growth in multifamily housing that was largely contributed to students, I'm curious to know if we're able to look at something that would say that it's actually due to growth in student population, like we just have higher enrollment, or if it's actually migration that's moved out of the neighborhoods where you had a high concentration of students all living, you know, 8 people to a single family dwelling. And now because now they have student specific housing, that is a trend. And so I'm just kind of curious if that's something that we were able to point to. And then there was another question that I had about,
can I answer that one first?
Yeah, go ahead, because I can't remember what I was going to ask, but I'll think of it.
Okay, and I just am going to do a shout out to Terry or Alyssa. I got a couple of messages from Linda, so if one of you could check and make sure that we're okay for the Zoom meeting that's going on right now, that'd be great. So regarding enrollment, we did not do a correlation of housing numbers compared to U of O enrollment. There is a recommendation in the report to keep an eye on enrollment. We will have to do that the next time we do the UGB analysis, because we did pull out you know, it's difficult to define what student, you know, people talk about student housing in different respects. It's difficult to define, but we did try to identify or flag development that was at least oriented towards students in some way, whether it was the name, the developer name, the collegiate, you know, things like that, or it was around the university. And what we found is that if we pulled those developments out of the analysis, the density on commercial and high density land actually went down pretty significantly, particularly on commercial land. So I'm just looking for that really quickly here. So let's see, commercial, the density on commercial goes down from 78 units per acre to 31 when what we have loosely identified as student housing is excluded. And then development, high density on developed land drops from 22 to 12 when student housing is excluded. So we do see some pretty big changes in at least the results at this point. And so we need to keep an eye on that going forward, but we haven't done that correlation that you're talking about.
Okay, thank you. That's super helpful. And then the other quick question, I apologize, Dan, I'll let you go, but I'm curious, and I can't believe I didn't think about this, but this body is very used to seeing all the quasi-judicial application, you know, we deal with the appeals. And I'm curious if we had thought to make a correlation between development that has happened and the type of application process that was that it had to go through. So for example, if we see a lot of multifamily in commercial zones, and those were, you know, we saw a lot more than we expected, yet we were really behind what we projected on, you know, maybe things that were much more, I don't want to make contentious, but also, you know, there was much more of a public process that maybe led to appeals and things like that. And so I'm actually kind of curious about the difference in the applications for the different types of developments that we saw. So I guess that's thought that I had.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think that would be something that would be like that additional research that is needed. So what we're doing in monitoring is showing the data. Here's the results. Here's the bean counting. And now sometimes we need to do additional research, such as through the UGB analysis, to actually get to some of those correlations that we really can't do in monitoring, where you're just comparing data to data. We have to really limit the amount of additional research that we're doing in monitoring. But that's, yeah, that could be something during the UGB analysis.
Commissioner Isaacson.
Commissioner Taylor took a good chunk of what I was going to ask, so we're aligned on our thoughts. Back to the heat map, it looked to me as though almost 40%, just as a rough eye sketch of the development that was new, was in and around the university area, and it kind of coincides with what you were saying about that you have this precipitous drop when you start to try to pull out or try to discern what's student housing, what isn't, because if you don't look at that, it looks like we're pretty on par. I mean, we have 17,000 new residents out of 34,000 that we're trying to get to over 20 years. We're halfway through it. We're halfway to the number. We're halfway through on new dwellings, but we keep slipping further and further behind on dwellings for folks who are not going to the university. So it seems like a student growth overlap is such a key component of this, to try to figure out how many new students are coming in, where are they going to stay, where are they going to live, as opposed to folks who are coming here for the normal purpose of serving our community in some other way. And maybe we should be looking at pulling that data out as a separate entity, because it looks from the top line like we're right on par, but you drive down any road and you look up any newspaper and you realize we're clearly not, right? So to have this come out, a bit of a disconnect between what we're presenting and the reality on the ground, without having that without that layer. And I get that it's going to be difficult given what is student housing and what isn't. I don't know how to necessarily solve that for you, but it's hard not to imagine that we don't have that as a component going forward. And then the next thing I was going to ask was, have we thought about, or do we have any feedback from builders or contractors on why there's a gap? I mean, obviously it's more profitable, clearly, based on the numbers, to build multifamily units. Are there things that they would need to kind of grease the skid on the larger gaps we already have? Because again, if they were already off the mark with student housing baked in, if you pull it out, I imagine that those numbers are even worse, which again feeds the high cost of housing for rent and the high cost of sales price that we're seeing reflected in the earlier presentation.
Yeah, so just going back to your first point, as I mentioned, we actually did pull out student housing oriented with regard to density and the amount of housing that would be happening on certain land types, recognizing that just that very issue that you brought up, that there is multifamily housing and then there is student oriented housing as we've defined it, and just needing to make sure we call that out. So we did try to do that to the degree that we could. I think that's, again, that additional research that needs to be done as part of the why. So when we get to the next UGB analysis, we are going to have to look for more efficiency measure strategies, which we'll talk about in a minute, why we'll probably have to do that. And those strategies could be exactly what you were just talking about. What are the things that would help to grease the skids, as you said, for different housing types? And those can be efficiency measure strategies. And once we adopt those, then that's where growth monitoring comes in to measure the success or lack thereof of those strategies, but it isn't intended to identify what those strategies should be, but it's setting the stage for that conversation. So more to come. And I just want to also just flag that we still need to talk about employment development and the buildable lands inventory and our preliminary estimates. So we have about 6 slides before we get to the recommendations. So I just wanted to flag that.
Okay, any other questions? I'm not seeing any. Okay, I think you can go on, Heather.
We'll move on to employment development. So employment development also happened in many areas of the city, as you can see on this map. The different colors indicate the permits by monitoring subcategory. So there was a total of 327 employment permits, which include permits for new development and redevelopment, as well as additions, and a little over 2 million net new building square feet. As part of the urban growth boundary analysis, we adopted a portfolio of large industrial sites to meet those growing needs. But at this point, none of those large lots have developed. This isn't surprising, though, because many of those lots are within the UGB expansion area and are unannexed. The employees per acre, or the density of jobs on a development site, is similar to the adopted forecast for all categories, so commercial, non-retail, commercial, retail, industrial. And then efficiency measures for employment development have not succeeded in spurring employment development as intended. So far there's only been 17 acres out of the 174 forecast for the 20-year period that have developed using efficiency measures. So a couple of examples of employment efficiency measures include downtown and riverfront urban renewal districts and the E1 and E2 employment zones. And of the 17 acres developed with employment efficiency measures, 12 were in the West Eugene Enterprise Zone, which actually wasn't a formally adopted efficiency measure, but it is something that we are monitoring. And then next slide. In total, 279 acres have developed with employment development out of the 1,457 forecasts, which is only 19%. Similar to housing, there has been more employment development on developed land and also committed land than expected. So about 90% of the developed forecast has already been met for employment development. And as I mentioned with the large lot portfolio, about half of the industrial forecast acres are in the UGB expansion area and aren't served with utilities needed for annexation and development. Questions about employment development?
Questions? Commissioner Isaacson.
This might be very granular, but do you have a sense of on the economic development wages? In other words, is there parts of the city that are paying more? Are there the narrow traffic corridors so that we're not having to rely as much on kind of the main arteries to get to and from their work? Do we have an idea if it's more minimum wage, or is it kind of growth categories that are in the outlying areas and we're kind of concentrating our wealth more towards the center of town? Just thoughts.
we don't have that data. I don't know, Heather, do you want to jump in at all on this?
And I'll also kick it over to Anne if she has anything she wants to say. Popcorn here. But I mean, I think in general, right, Elena, we have seen in general wages increase, but we don't have it by area. We do have wage data by employment sector, but not by area. Is sector the right industry, Anne? Is that right? Industry?
Yeah, by employment, we have average wage by sector. I think we could look at the data. We can't. It's you can't disclose it. But actually, I do know offhand the West Eugene, where that's most of our manufacturing facilities are in West Eugene, not downtown, and manufacturing jobs tend to pay pretty good wages. And so I think the wage distribution, I'd be surprised if there was much of a geographic correlation there. But we don't have that. We haven't done that analysis here.
Okay, other questions? Okay.
Now we'll take a look at some of the takeaways from the 2021 buildable lands inventory. This was a snapshot in time with an effective date of January 1st, 2021, so it does not account for any development occurring since then. For residential lands, we estimate a capacity of 12,000 dwelling units, 57% of which are estimated to be on flat lots. And the map on the right shows the residential land in the goldish color. So both partially vacant and undeveloped residential lands. About 40% of those buildable lands that are residential are unannexed, and that equates to 829 acres on low and medium density residential. We use that as a proxy to try and identify roughly how many acres or lots would be unserved by utilities. And about 158 of those acres, the largest concentration, are in the Crow Road area where you see the mouse hovering right now. And about 54% of those buildable acres are also on lots that are smaller than 5 acres. For employment on employment lands, we estimated about 18,700 jobs, a capacity for that many, and the employment lands are shown on blue in the map. About 58% of those employment lands are unannexed, and that percentage goes up even more to 63% if you just take a look at the industrial buildable acres. Most of that land, the highest concentration, can be found in the Clear Lake UGB expansion area where the mouse is now, and that is about 589 acres.
Thanks, Thea. So where the 2021 buildable lands inventory snapshot fits in is it helps us get a ballpark estimate of whether or not our land supply today, in quotes, could meet a new 20-year demand if we started UGB planning right now, which we know we're going to have to do soon because of the new state requirement for adopting our housing analysis by December of 2026. So to get a ballpark estimate, we use the most recent population and employment forecasts that we discussed earlier in this presentation, and assumed that those were the new 20-year demands. And then we compared those demands to the 2021 BLI snapshot that Thea just went through and the estimated capacity that she mentioned. So what you see there is that preliminarily, there would be a shortage of land for about 4,000 dwellings. And those are particularly for dwellings on medium and high density land. There would also be a shortage for about capacity for about 6,000 new jobs, and that is particularly for commercial jobs. However, these estimates will change when we do the actual UGB analysis due to things like new state statutes. We haven't taken into account demand for other land needs like infrastructure, parks, or schools. And then we'll be updating our assumptions. We'll probably have new population, potentially a new population forecast, a new jobs forecast. We haven't factored in capacity from redevelopment, and then we'll actually have more monitoring data that we can add into the mix. So questions about how that fits into growth monitoring. That was one of the goals that we had with growth monitoring. Was what you heard about with most of the presentation was comparing monitoring results to our adopted assumptions. And this is really takes a little bit of a pivot and says, okay, now that we've got all that information, if we took that information and started our UGB planning now, what would we be looking at?
Commissioner Fragola.
So based on the fact that middle housing draft code hasn't been adopted, I'm going to guess that that type of development or land use is not included in this analysis. And so when we're looking at that snapshot estimate or evaluation comparison, that we're not looking at the potential of housing that can be added by infill or middle housing development. Is that correct?
Yes, that estimate does not. If you look in the report at the end of the executive summary, and I can give you a page number, the statute and rules regarding middle housing actually say they recognize the fact that as soon as jurisdictions adopt their middle housing code amendments, they won't have data to estimate how much additional capacity that they're getting from those code amendments necessarily. And so the statutes or the rules say that you can assume up to, so you don't have to assume a 3% increase, but it's up to a 3% increase in capacity. And so off the top of my head, you'd have to look in the report, but I think we said that was about 350 additional dwellings based on just using the numbers that we have right now, which again will change. So when we do the UGB analysis, we'll have to have a conversation about within the range of 0 to 3%, what should we assume for an increase in capacity due to the middle housing code amendments?
Great. And then I had another question based on some of the information that you shared about annexed versus unannexed land. And it seemed like for employment opportunities that from what I heard, there's significant lack of development on unannexed land. And I'm wondering if there is that parallel around housing development. And then I guess I would be curious to know if we have efficiency measures that are targeting development on unannexed land in order to encourage development for both employment and housing in those areas, because it seems like there's a barrier on unannexed land. And I think we could all guess what that is.
Yeah, so when we get to the recommendations, one of the things that you may remember from the housing implementation pipeline project or plan is that a recognition that sites aren't going to develop if they don't have the capital improvements there. It's just too expensive for properties to develop. And so while we are using, so I just went back to our residential lands slide here, 40% of the buildable acres, so these are what we're considering the buildable acres, vacant and partially vacant or underdeveloped land, 40% of those are unannexed. And so it doesn't mean, I think Theo was saying, doesn't mean that they don't have services, but it's a quick and dirty proxy that we can use to say, hey, 40% of our land supply is unannexed, and probably a big portion of that is because it doesn't have the capital improvements to it to develop. And so when you don't have the capital improvements there and they're too expensive for an individual developer to do, then we have a land supply that is just going to sit there.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
Commissioner Isaacson.
Thank you. I know that the plan is to revisit this data on a periodic timetable. When is the next time you're going to revisit it?
Yeah, so we are collecting data regularly. Some data comes out annually, building permit data comes out all of the time. Some things are harder to do, so we're only going to do them occasionally, like rerunning the buildable lands inventory takes quite a bit of analysis time. We spent a number of meetings at the ETAC reviewing that methodology and reviewing the data. So we don't want to do that all the time. But so what the plan is that annually we will report on key development trends. So things like density, housing mix, if there's a new forecast, population or employment forecast. And if you look in the report, there's actually a list of what we've identified. There's a table that's called the data comparison snapshot, and that has all of the data that we're anticipating reporting on annually. So it's quite a bit. And then a comprehensive report like this would only be done every 5 years.
The reason I ask is I think that when you started this or looking at the data to begin with 10 years ago, none of us would have guessed, pandemic, what looks like we're going into potentially a recession and significant amounts of inflation, all the while we're building on top of an already dwindling housing supply and depression on all the different key metrics that this report covers, right? So it would seem that if we could have as part of that report or update rather, what the forecast was at that moment in time, a year from now, 5 years from now, or whenever you're going to be adding that layer of data in, and then what the actual is, and see how far we are off of it, to get an idea. How is HB 21 expanding our inventory? Is it in line with what our forecast was? Are we exceeding it? Are we under? And then we're using the data that we're getting from feedback from folks to be able to layer that on top as well, along with the other layers such as student housing and the jobs report, to be able to get an idea for where are the weak points that we can, not necessarily us, but other policymakers can drill down on and try to make some movement on before we get to the 10-year report or the end of this and go, well, we missed on this mark, but had we have known this, we would have been able to do something about it. Just a thought.
Yeah, so we are measuring building permit data every year, and we're doing it by housing type. And so when middle housing, which is essentially an efficiency measure, comes in, gets adopted, we'll update our terminology, and we'll be tracking issue building permits by housing type. So that we will be able to report on annually, no problem. Well, I say no problem. It will take staff resources. But yeah, we will be reporting on that. We know that that is front of mind. Census data is another one. So housing affordability is one that is relatively easy for us to report on annually. And we have that identified as well. Yeah, so and when I said a comprehensive report every 5 years, there's also an asterisk with that that says as needed. And so when we go into the UGB analysis, there's monitoring and then there's the UGB analysis, and that is going to be a really big effort. That's where we can actually research things, and so we'll be incorporating monitoring data and then diving deeper into it with some of the things that you've identified tonight.
Okay. Other questions? I don't see any, so.
So y'all have gotten ahead of us a tiny bit and touched on some of the recommendations that I'm going to talk about right now. But based on the report findings and the review by ETAC, staff is recommending that City Council consider the following growth monitoring or planning related actions. So overarching recommendations include comprehensive UGB planning. So not just planning for our housing needs as required by the new state deadline, but in light of recent forecasts for job growth, to also plan for other land needs, such as jobs, parks, schools, and infrastructure. To continue monitoring the effectiveness of efficiency measures, both for housing and employment. So consider how they might be effective, whether they need funding, and if there are other measures the city can pursue. And then infrastructure needs, as we just mentioned. So prioritizing the extension of capital projects to provide services to undeveloped residential areas within the UGB, which is consistent with the housing implementation pipeline, as well as continuing to plan for infrastructure and service improvements for the Clear Lake UGB expansion area for employment land. And then related to housing, support the housing implementation pipeline and its goals for addressing the existing underproduction of housing, which includes strategies for more housing for households with low incomes. And then in terms of middle housing, monitor the impacts of the land use code changes associated with implementation of House Bill 2001, such as changes to the types and densities of new housing. Also just touched on that. And then, as mentioned earlier, University of Oregon enrollment. So consider how changes in student enrollment projections at the U of O might impact future housing demand for both student and non-student population, such as types and densities of new dwellings needed. And then for employment, looking at market changes. So exploring whether employment is still growing and if the need for employment land is also growing or if less land is needed. So for example, with retail, will the increase in online purchasing impact the need for land for retail buildings? Something to continue watching. So these are the overarching recommendations, and I'll open it up for comments or discussion.
So comments or discussion? I've got a quick comment. Staring at, as I went through and then looking at focusing on the housing recommendations, I guess I just want to, maybe this sounds pretty obvious, but would definitely agree with what you've got there. And it seems like certainly coming out of our work on middle housing, I guess we're almost out of our work on middle housing during the last 18 or 20 months. The production of housing and the provision of housing in this community is just, it has to be a real front and center high priority. So as I look at what you're suggesting there, I think those focuses are good. I'm looking at the first three. Well, certainly paying attention to U of O enrollment factors in, but when I look at the first three, I certainly agree. Others? Commissioner Fragola, please.
I was just going to ask, I do have some additional comments, but is this the last slide? And if so, might we stop sharing, or do you have any other slides to share?
We do. After this, we'll go through emerging issues, and then we'll touch on council, what we should highlight for council, and then briefly talk about next steps.
Okay, I'll hold.
Okay, I'm not seeing any other questions. Why don't you, Heather, why don't you go ahead and move on through the slides, and then we can open it up. And I think it's a good idea to open up the screen and we can discuss them.
Okay, sure. So moving on to emerging issues. Similarly to recommendations, we've got the 3 buckets of emerging issues. The emerging issues are at the end of the report, and they're a list of issues that could emerge in growth monitoring in the future or in other planning related projects. So I'm not, in the interest of time, I'm not going to read through all of them. I think some of the big ticket items in the overarching emerging issues are the climate friendly and equitable communities, which is new state rules that are currently under development, and will they'll add requirements for compact development and things like parking. For housing, the first 2 bullets, the housing production strategies and the regional housing needs analysis, those are also both new state requirements that will impact how we plan for housing during our next UGB analysis. And then for employment, this is similar, a little bit similar to the recommendations, but changes in overall employment trends regarding things like self-employment, which we don't have good data on, remote working, and any resulting changes in employment density that could result from changes in those other 2 areas. Will any of the trends that we've seen in the recent years, like the increase in remote working, become the new normal and change how land is needed for employment in the future? So, so I'll just move into council highlights. We did also want to hear from you regarding what you've heard today, and in your role as policy advisors to council, we want to know what you think are the most important things to highlight for them when we bring this report. And so I can come back to any of these slides. And then really briefly, next steps. So this document is still draft. In fact, I found an error in it today. So we continue to do overall document polishing, formatting, formatting of charts, edits. If we find a typo like the one I found today, we're trying to get that all cleaned up. As you can imagine, it's a pretty big process given the breadth of the data. But this is all in preparation for presenting it to council, which you can see there is currently scheduled for June 8th. The rest of 2022 will be continued chart development, development of a public-facing data dashboard to make the data more accessible, and then moving into our first regular cycle of an annual report that we talked about earlier. So I am going to stop sharing and mute myself.
Okay, so comments or discussion? And Commissioner Ramey.
Thank you, Chair Beeson. First, so excuse me, with regard to carrying this forward to the council, I think number 1 is just the enormous importance of this work. We cannot emphasize enough, I cannot, how helpful this is as we go forward. And I just want to be sure that is carried forward from me, and if others share that as well. And then secondarily, the quality and depth of the work for our first run at it, it's really amazing. And I think it has a lot of really really great data points in it, and it's a very helpful document the way it's presented. I would recommend a couple things, and we've talked about them. I even saw one of them in the suggestions, I think, of that second to last slide there, about comparator communities to us. So are there other communities that we can compare to, or other parts of the state or other counties? And it came up a few times tonight as well. I think that's helpful to policymakers or others, just understanding where we are in the context of the state or in the context of other communities like us. And related to that, but not exactly the same, is the idea, again, that this is our first run at this. And we can't know at this point whether the data is telling us anything or not, because we only have one data point. I know it's not entirely accurate. We have some history back and forth, but in terms of this report. And so you mentioned some data collected every year, some then in the comprehensive plan in a 5-year cycle. And I would say that you can't really tell what's going on until you see it like 3 times in a row. So you see it once and you go, okay, that's interesting. You see it twice and you realize it's not the same as it was the last time. So what happened there? But once you see it the 3rd time, then you begin to bracket where that is following in a continuum over time. And so my experience with this kind of work is that you really need to understand the trend that's happening, because you can't tell whether it's a one-time problem. That issue about the multi-unit housing units, that could be a 5-year uptick in developers taking advantage of a student housing market. And you could not see any of that again for 10 more years. I don't know if that'll happen, but that's an example. And so by the time you got through your 2nd or 3rd cycle, you would realize, oh, that was a 1-year blip. In the 20-year period, we're okay. But for that time, or that was a 1 cycle blip. So having patience, as you stated many times, is really important. Not sort of knee-jerking at some of these beginning numbers and saying, well, let's be sure we get them all in context here. We're just starting down this road. And then finally, just to demonstrate that I did actually read the entire report, my favorite part, and I'm sure we all have our favorites, my favorite part was attachment C, which I'm not sure is part of the report, but it looks like it might be a poster or something. But wow, I just kept reading that over and over again, all these great fun data points about where we're falling in poverty, and for the other commissioners, it's at the very end of the packet, the last page there, and really presented in a way that's easy to understand and helpful and bright and cheery colors. And thank you for that. So again, tell the council this is super important. Tell the council that we thought it was really well done. Well done. Thank you all. And then just a few things about this context of other cities and context over time with data. Thank you very much.
Commissioner Edwards.
Thanks, Ken. I promise I'll be brief because I know we're trying to move on, but I wanted to say a couple things. This work that really, obviously it was in depth. You can tell by the very large appendices that are there that I'm sure Commissioner Ramey was referring to. And the staff was absolutely incredible. And some of the tools that we used were, that was pretty mind blowing. So there's that I just want to put out there and say. But the other thing, John Brodsky and I both sit on ETAC, and John is obviously served on this planning commission. And we couldn't help ourselves oftentimes from starting to talk about policies and things like that. And we had to kind of rein it in. And I'm excited. And I think that I want to share with this group because really the idea behind having this data that we can start to make data-driven decisions that are where the policy stuff comes in. And that's our job and that's the council. And so, I think that the idea here is just to make sure that we're capturing the information that we need in order to make sound decisions. And if there's, things that are missing or whatever, we can't figure out how to point to stuff, whether it's working or not. I think that's kind of the point of really vetting this through both the planning commission and then obviously it'll go on to council. But I'm super excited about it. I'm really excited to start talking about policy and stuff. And I think that we've got a lot of really incredible data that everybody did an amazing job just kind of sifting through it and making it, be relevant. So I think that's essentially where we landed. So that's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Fragola.
Thank you. Yeah, I also wanted to appreciate the work of the ETAC committee and of staff on the system. I agree with Commissioner Rainey that it's really important that we look at long-term trends. And, we're also looking at data up to 2018 primarily. And I'm looking forward to some of these annual data reports that we start to get that will help us inform policy decision making more, because the time period between 2018 and 2022 we know is a really significant time period in our community's history. And so I think it'll be interesting to see what that data looks like, as well as the information that we'll begin to get as we emerge from the pandemic. I'm really curious about some of the population forecasts, particularly the decreasing population forecasts, and how that does compare to some of the emerging issues like climate migration. I'm guessing we probably don't have that much information on it yet, but we know that it's starting to actively happen. And so, I really wonder about that overall decrease in population and how that might change. And I am very interested in the impacts of climate migration and what that's going to do to the data. I also was really intrigued by what both Commissioner Isaacson and Edwards were pointing out about the impact of student housing on the overall data. I have concerns that it potentially impacts the total outcome of the data when we have such significant amount of housing developed. And what that means when we're analyzing the data. And I think that there may be a need for there to be greater disaggregation around some of that information, because we all know that there is a significant housing shortage. And yet when you look at some of that data, I think some people could assume that there isn't. And then I'm really interested in what types of efficiency measures we can utilize to target the vacancy rate. And I mean, maybe that's build more housing, right? Maybe that's it, but maybe there are other efficiency measures besides that. So thank you very much for this work. And I think my only sadness is that I won't get to serve on the Planning Commission long enough to really see it come to fruition.
Thank you. Commissioner Isaacson.
Yeah, I also want to commend staff for this. I love data when it's pulled in such a way that it really moves the direction of a conversation, and I feel like that's what this is doing. The only recognition I would have for your argument to City Council, your letter to City Council, would be to focus it in terms of the snapshot in time of where we are. This is a big ship, and it's going to take a lot of movement either way to turn it. So if we're essentially saying we are halfway through the cycle or the examination point, right? We have 10 more years into it, then the recommendations should be geared toward that. That this is our target to hit. This is how we recommend we're going to be able to hit it. And if we know it going along, we're going to see these metrics start to play out. And if we're not, then it gives you time to be able to make the adjustments, to be able to self-correct. That's what I would want to see. And I think that that's important, that they don't see this as, well, we've hit 50% and we're halfway through it, so you know, we can pretty much just kind of coast here and hit the goal. There's going to have to be work done and actions taken to be able to hit that last 50% and then some, because we already identified that just hitting the goal isn't doing it. We're going to need to go above and beyond that to kind of compensate for the student housing effect, whatever you want to call that, student housing coefficient, whatever mathematical equation you want to use. And so that is kind of paramount, that this is not just a report that gets buried into the other reports, that this is a call to action, that there has to be substantive changes made to start turning the ship back toward more housing, lower rents, lower property price acquisition costs, and so on.
Thank you. I see Heather's hand is up.
Yeah, thank you. Just really quick. This is something we didn't mention in the beginning. So now that I know you all are so interested in the different data points, on page 36 of the agenda packet, we have a data source and collection table. And it takes all of the different data that we pulled into this report and tells you the period that we're looking at that data. So for our population estimates, we've incorporated the forecasts. You know, we're reporting on the forecast we've gotten all the way through the most recent one, which is 2021. Building permit data is all the way through July of 2021. Jobs data is just through 2018. And so, but I just wanted to point that out because it's a little bit tricky and it's a little bit confusing, I find, because you think our monitoring period is all the data is through 2021. And a lot of it is, but not all of it. I also wanted to touch on climate migration because that is something that we hear a lot about. We did add a footnote in the report and the appendices. We regularly check back with PSU every time we get a forecast. Do you have a new model that you're incorporating into your population forecasting to specifically address climate migration? The answer is no. They have said that, you know, when one becomes available that there is high confidence in, that they can look at reporting that and or including that, and they have reached out to folks that are in that area of work to try to identify a model specific to that. But at this point, the best way that they can address migration in general, regardless whether it's coming here or leaving here because of climate, is to provide us a forecast more regularly. Before we only got them when we were requested. Now we get them every 4 years. So that's how they're addressing that. So thank you. I just wanted to also say thank you.
Thanks. So I'll echo what's been said. I also want to say thank you. Appreciate what's been done here to the staff, all of the work that's gone into this. There has been a tremendous amount of material here, and I found myself learning quite a bit. I also have a lot left to learn. I kind of invited myself to spend some time with Heather and talk a little bit more, go down some of the side roads a bit. Also express thank you to Kevin and Tiffany and to the ETAC, the community people who've been involved in this. I guess are continuing to be involved for some period of time. And I think all of this is really good work. I have some of the same, I'm just really interested how this is going to evolve as it goes on year after year and how it's going to unfold. And I have some of the same questions about things like the climate migration and some of that. The only other quick comment I have, and this needs zero response, I'm still sort of processing it. I thought the 3% number for estimated units of middle housing on the base of 12,000 units of housing or whatever it was. And I thought that seemed awfully low. And I've been kind of trying to process that. But that we can save that and talk about it for some other time. I was trying to translate that into years and what that meant. And it started to feel to me like kind of just a few sort of units. So just a comment to throw out there. Does anyone else have any last comment?
I don't know if Kevin, you have anything you want to add as our ETAC representative?
Well, just underline both the tremendous work done by the staff and by ETAC members like Commissioner Edwards and John Borowski, who used to serve on your planning commission. You know, it's what I reflect on is are the challenges that you guys are facing. Planning staff is given a box to work with by state law of what kind of data to take in to do the UGB analysis. And that's one box. But the community can look at issues outside those boxes. So growth projections by Portland State University are a crystal ball. You know, there's science behind it. They have a, you know, there's a methodology, but it's important, I think, for the Planning Commission and City Council to use their judgment in creating public policy that goes above and beyond the UGB analysis box that's established by state law. And that's just a challenge because you want to base your decisions on data and projections, you know, are looking at the future, and we all know just how challenging that is. So that's where your judgment is going to be very important, and the judgment of our elected officials is going to be really, really important. But again, as I said before, having the underlying data as a foundation for forming those judgments will be key, so that you're standing on solid ground as you kind of reach into the dark room. Oh. Thanks for all your service too. I know you've been in some tumultuous times and tumultuous issues to deal with. So I commend your efforts.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you to everybody. So I'm going to turn it over to Alyssa and have some final comments.
Excellent. Thank you. It's really good to see all of your faces. It was the last time we had a planning commission meeting was in early March when you had your public hearing on the Greenway code amendments, and that feels like a long time ago. But listening to you all engage tonight and the level of detail that you dug into this dense material, I just want to express my gratitude for the Planning Commission. You guys you're outstanding. I can't believe you all read all of that. That was so much to read. I mean, I know you would, and I know you did, and that's just, you guys just do such fabulous work for our community. So thank you. I just have a bunch of things. I'm going to rattle through some dates, and I'm happy to send these in an email. So your next scheduled meeting is the 26th of April, and we're going to be canceling that because we don't have a topic for you. After that, you have 3 meetings right now scheduled for May the 10th, which right now we don't have an item. We added the 17th for a work session on the Greenway. And then you also have the 24th, which I believe we may be holding for a potential appeal. And then we've polled you for some dates in May and June as well for a potential land use appeal. And we'll keep you posted on that. We are really looking forward to seeing you in person at some point this year. Last night, several of us attended the council's first in-person meeting. It was just staff and the council. We still are working out, there's a new state law that requires that any in-person meetings that we have with public bodies, that be a hybrid meeting. So we're still working through that technology. We're letting council work the kinks out of that. There were some issues, it sounds like, with their later meeting. And so we're waiting for the city to figure out the technology before we bring you all back in person and with the hybrid meeting. So thanks for your patience on that. And then speaking of council, on Monday, they have their public hearing on middle housing. So I'm going to guess you'll all be watching that. They'll start their deliberations in May, and they will be going on May 11th, 18th, and with action is scheduled for the 23rd. So I know you've been pretty invested in that process, so stay tuned. And then I'm sure you've noticed quite well that there's only 5 of you right now. So we are working really hard on getting the 2 vacancies filled. The recruitment for Thomas Fiorelli, who left, I think in November, the interviews for that are on the 18th. And so we should know shortly there. I'm not sure that they've scheduled them with the people, but that's when the interviews will be held. And then shortly thereafter, we should have that replacement. There is an open recruitment right now for Kristen Taylor's position, and also Tiffany's, whose comes to an end, although she can reapply. And that recruitment ends this Friday, and they on the tentative schedule, they're looking interviews in mid-May at council. So that is all I have for you now, unless you have any questions for me about any of that or anything else.
Thank you. Commissioner Edwards.
Quick question. We talked about having planning commissioner, somebody, I don't know if it was Chair Beeson or somebody who was going to be testifying at the council hearing. And then there was a few of us that wanted to testify on behalf of ourselves. And so I just didn't know if there is any issues with quorum or anything like that. And I just wanted to make sure that we talk about that if we need to. I'm going to be testifying on behalf of myself. So just putting it out there.
You all made a motion having Commissioner Beeson, Chair Beeson testify, Chair Beeson and at least one other person testify on behalf of the Planning Commission. I know we checked in with the city attorney about, if there's actually 5 of you that want to testify, how we can make that work. I don't know that I can find that email very quickly, unless Terry's looking for it already.
I wasn't, but we can follow up with you by email.
Yeah.
My recollection was that as long as we're not representing the Planning Commission, we can provide public comment. And we're not meeting and deliberating on actions or outcomes. And I think if all 5 of us gave public comment as individuals, we would, from what I recall from the email, we would be fine.
Yeah, I think we should approach it that way, unless we hear something specifically different from you guys. I was kind of assuming that was going to be the case because we're not having a meeting or anything. Anything else? Okay. Mr. Edwards.
Sorry, do we know the content of was Commissioner Beeson gonna write something? I can't remember what we decided. I apologize. As far as like what he was gonna focus on in the.
You passed a motion to delegate that to him,
yeah.
And Commissioner Beeson is working on his testimony and asking for some information from the staff. So it's in the works. It's good.
Okay, good. All right, that's it. Sorry.
All right, it's good, all good. Okay, I'm not seeing any other hands, so I think what we'll do is adjourn. Thank you all very much, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.